They destroyed a human colony. Now 300,000 Terran warships are headed their way. The signal came in at 03:47 station time. I was already awake. Sleep had stopped being a reliable thing for me about 6 months into my posting at the Terran Strategic Intelligence Hub, and that night I had been sitting at my desk, reading old field reports with a cold cup of coffee beside me. When the alert tone sounded, I did not jump. I simply looked at the screen, read the header line, and felt something inside me go completely still. New Carthage, emergency beacon, all channels. My name is Yale Marsh. I'm a commander in the Terran Fleet Intelligence Division, and in 11 years of service I have read thousands of distress signals. Most of them were minor: engine failures, navigation errors, the occasional skirmish with unlicensed salvagers. But the moment I saw the words New Carthage printed in red across my terminal, I knew. I cannot explain how I knew. Something in the pattern of the alert, the strength of the signal, the way it was broadcasting on every frequency at once, all of it told me that what I was about to read was not minor. I opened the file. New Carthage was a colony world on the outer rim of Terran-claimed space. 2.4 million people. It had been settled 31 years ago, built by families who wanted open skies and red soil, and a place to call their own away from the crowded inner systems. The colony had farms, schools, a small university, 3 large towns, and a central city called Ardenmoor that had grown, over 3 decades, from a cluster of prefabricated shelters into a real place with cobblestone streets and a public garden, and a library that held physical books. I knew all of this because I had read the colony profile the moment the signal came in. I always read the profile. It helps me to remember that the data I work with is not just data. What the signal told me in its fragmented and desperate transmissions was this: Volkai warships had appeared in orbit above New Carthage at 01:14 local colony time. There had been no warning, no communication, no demand. The Volkai vessels had taken up position and within 4 minutes of arrival had begun an orbital incendiary strike. The kind that does not target military installations or defensive positions. The kind that is designed to make a surface uninhabitable. Completely and permanently. The strike lasted 11 minutes. I sat with that number for a long time. 11 minutes, 2.4 million people, 31 years of building something from nothing, gone in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. The distress signal had been sent automatically by the colony's emergency broadcast system. It had been triggered by the first impact. There were survival pod signals too, scattered and weak. We would find survivors in the days that followed. Hundreds of them, people who had been in deep underground shelters or far enough from the strike zones that the initial impacts had not reached them. But the colony itself, Ardenmoor, the farms, the university, the library with its physical books, all of it was gone. I spent the next 4 hours reconstructing the timeline from every piece of data we had. The colony's black box logs, the survival pod transmissions, the automated weather satellites that had still been functioning at the moment of the strike and had captured everything. I was methodical. I was professional. I have been trained to process information without letting emotion compromise the quality of my analysis, and I did exactly that. I worked through the night, building a precise and complete picture of what had happened. At 0722, the Volkai Dominion sent a diplomatic communication on the standard Concord channel. It was brief and stated, with the kind of calm that I found more unsettling than anger would have been, that New Carthage had been situated in a zone the Volkai considered to be contested space. They cited a territorial claim filed 40 years ago, before the colony had even been established. They called the strike a necessary action in defense of their sovereign claim. They did not apologize. They did not express any form of regret. They simply stated the facts as they saw them and closed the channel. I read that communication 3 times. Then I filed it in the archive and returned to my reconstruction work. At 09:00, the the Galactic Concord convened an emergency session. Representatives from 14 spacefaring civilizations gathered on the diplomatic channel. There was a great deal of talking. Words like proportionality and restraint and measured response were used many times. The Volkai representative attended and repeated their territorial argument. Several other species expressed sympathy for humanity's loss, while simultaneously urging us not to take any action that might destabilize the region. Our ambassador, a quiet and serious man named Quarter Vane, sat through 2 hours of this. Then he stood up, disconnected his terminal from the session, and left without saying a single word. I watched the recording of that moment several times that afternoon. At 14:00, I received a priority communication from Earth's Unified Command. It was a single page. It contained no lengthy explanation, no political language, no diplomatic hedging. It simply told me that I was being transferred to the Terran Strategic Reserve Command with immediate effect, and that I should report to Dock Station Aurelius within 48 hours. I had heard of the Strategic Reserve Command. Every officer in the fleet had heard of it, in the same way that you hear of something that exists at the edge of official conversation, mentioned occasionally in briefings, never elaborated upon, always handled with a kind of careful vagueness that tells you the subject is larger than what is being shared. I had assumed, for most of my career, that the Strategic Reserve was a contingency planning body. A group of analysts who modeled worst-case scenarios and wrote reports that went into sealed archives. I packed my things that evening. I did not sleep. I sat by the small window in my quarters and looked out at the stars for a long time. I thought about the library in Ardenmore. I thought about the children who would have been asleep when the first impacts came. I thought about what it means to build something and what it means to lose it. Then I picked up my orders, stood up, and began walking. The galaxy had made a mistake. It did not know this yet. I was only beginning to understand it myself. When my transport docked at Station Aurelius, I was expecting a standard military installation. What I found was something else entirely. The station was enormous, far larger than any facility I had seen in 11 years of service. It extended across 3 separate orbital rings, each one busy with ships coming and going, supply lines running at full capacity, personnel moving in organized streams along every corridor. There was no panic, no emergency scrambling. Everything was calm and efficient and purposeful in a way that told me this readiness had not been assembled in the 2 days since New Carthage. This had been here already, waiting. A junior officer named Petra Hollies met me at the dock. She was young, composed, and said very little as she escorted me through 2 security checkpoints and into a briefing room deep inside the station's core. Admiral Clem Acaffer was waiting for me. He was a large, steady man with gray at his temples and eyes that had the particular quality of someone who has thought very carefully about very difficult things for a very long time. He shook my hand, told me to sit down, and then he showed me the number. 300,000. I stared at the figure on the screen for so long that Acaffer eventually said, quietly, "Take your time." I did not know what to say. No one would have known what to say. 300,000 Terran warships. Not patrol vessels, not escort frigates, not the kind of light ships that make up the visible portion of any fleet. These were warships, fully armed, fully crewed, battle-ready. I had spent my entire career believing that humanity's active fleet numbered somewhere around 8,000 to 10,000 vessels. That was what the published records showed. That was what every intelligence briefing I had ever read had confirmed. "We have been building for 80 years, Acaffer said, in shipyards inside the gas giant orbits, in deep space facilities anchored to dark matter currents where long-range sensors cannot reach, in facilities hidden inside asteroid fields across 47 star systems. Generations of engineers and workers and their families, all of them contributing to this, all of them told the same thing." He paused, just in case. I understood it then. Not just the size of what I was looking at, but the nature of it. Humanity, in its quiet and patient and deeply practical way, had looked at the universe around it and asked the question that apparently no other species had thought to ask with the same seriousness. What if the worst happens? Not as an abstract worry, not as a philosophical exercise, but as an engineering problem. What do we need to build, and how long will it take, and how do we make sure it is ready before we ever need it? 80 years. 3 generations of human beings working in secret answering that question. The Volkai Dominion's intelligence networks had detected the early signs of Terran mobilization within 36 hours of the New Carthage strike. I know this because we intercepted their internal communications. Their analysts had reviewed the sensor data, cross-referenced it with their own records of Terran military capacity, and concluded with high confidence that the activity was either a bluff or an error in our own sensor arrays. Their most optimistic estimate placed the Terran combat fleet at around 8,000 vessels. They were wrong by a factor of 37. I watched their communications with something I can only describe as a cold, quiet clarity. These were the people who had looked at New Carthage and decided it was an acceptable action. These were the people who had filed a territorial claim and decided it gave them the right to end 2.4 million lives. And now they were looking at the early signals of what was coming for them and deciding it could not be what it appeared to be, because nothing in their experience had prepared them to imagine it. That was the thing about humanity that the rest of the galaxy had never fully understood. We imagine things. We imagine the bad things especially, the disasters, the worst cases, the scenarios that everyone else prefers not to think about, and then we plan for them. We build for them. We spend generations preparing for the moment that every other species hopes will never come, because hope is not a strategy and humans have always known that. The mobilization itself was quiet and organized. There was no great announcement, no dramatic broadcast. The 300,000 ships began moving toward their assigned departure coordinates across 14 star systems, and the process was so large and so methodical that it looked, on the long-range sensors that other civilizations trained on us, less like a military action and more like a tide going out. Other species noticed. Of course they noticed. You cannot move a fleet of that size without the galaxy seeing it. Within 72 hours of the mobilization order, I was tracking sensor feeds from no fewer than 11 different civilizations who had trained their long-range arrays on Terran space. I read their communications as they came in, translated and flagged by our intelligence systems. The words they used across all 11 civilizations were variations of the same theme: impossible, error, miscalculation, cannot be confirmed. One Volkai analyst, in an internal message that was never meant to be read by anyone outside their command network, wrote something that I saved to my personal archive and have kept there ever since. He wrote, "If the Terran sensor readings are accurate, we have made an error of historic proportions." He was right, but by then it was far too late for that to matter. I stood at the observation deck of Station Aurelius on the 3rd morning after my arrival, looking out at the departure formations assembling across the star field. Even from this distance, even with the vast scale of space reducing everything to points of light, I could see the shape of what was coming. It was like watching a mountain move, slow and inevitable and beyond any individual's power to affect. I thought of New Carthage. I thought of the 11 minutes. I thought of the automated distress signal broadcasting into empty space, long after there was no one left on the surface to hear the reply. The fleet was moving, and the galaxy was about to learn what it had always overlooked about the quiet, patient, endlessly prepared species that had been building in the dark for 80 years. The Galactic Concord emergency session that convened on the 4th day after full Terran mobilization was, by any measure, the most chaotic diplomatic gathering in the Concord's 400-year history. I watched the transcript feed in real time from my station inside the Strategic Reserve Command, And I can tell you that there were moments when the sheer number of species trying to speak simultaneously overwhelmed the translation protocols and reduced the whole transmission to an incomprehensible noise. 6 different civilizations had sent representatives to offer mediation. 3 of those civilizations had, within the last decade, declined to formally acknowledge New Carthage as a recognized Terran colony under conquered protection. I noted this without surprise. Guilt has a way of making people very eager to be helpful after the fact. The Volkai Dominion's position had shifted considerably from their initial communication. The calm, cold certainty with which they had announced their territorial claim was gone. In its place was something that I recognized, even through the translation, as fear. Not the dramatic, visible kind of fear. The quiet kind. The kind that makes you choose your words very carefully and keep your voice steady because you know that the wrong tone will make things worse, and things are already very bad. Their Grand Council had, in the 3 days since mobilization began, offered the following in sequence: a full and formal apology for the incident at New Carthage, an offer of significant resource reparations valued at roughly 40 times the assessed economic output of the colony, a commitment to immediately withdraw all territorial claims on the contested zone, and the court-martial and removal of Admiral Drev Sohain, the officer who had ordered the strike. Our ambassador Quarter Vane, when presented with this list of offers in the session, said 4 words. He said them clearly and without emphasis, the way you state a fact that does not require argument. It is not sufficient. Then he closed his audio channel and sat in silence for the remainder of the session. I had been given a secondary intelligence role during the diplomatic phase, which meant I was monitoring all incoming and outgoing communications, flagging anything operationally relevant, and feeding summaries to the command team. It also meant I was sometimes present in rooms where conversations happened that were not officially recorded. One of those conversations happened on the 5th day. A Volkai diplomat named Save Arath contacted our intelligence network and asked, specifically, to speak with me. I had met Arath 9 years earlier, during a joint scientific mission to map a newly discovered binary star system at the edge of explored space. We had spent 3 weeks on the same research vessel. He was a careful, thoughtful person with a deep interest in stellar cartography, and we had spent many off-duty hours in the observation lounge, talking about stars and space and the long, slow history of the universe. I had liked him. I still did, in the way that you can like someone and still understand that what has happened cannot be undone by personal feeling. He appeared on my screen looking older than I remembered. His species aged differently from humans, but the weight on him was visible regardless. He said, "Yale, please, help me find a way through this." I looked at him for a moment. I thought about what I wanted to say, and then I decided to say the true thing instead of the diplomatic thing, because the time for diplomatic things was behind us. "Save," I said, "you had one job. Every species in this galaxy has known for as long as humans have been out here that there is one thing you do not do. You do not strike a human colony. You do not hurt our people on our worlds. That was the line. It was the only line that mattered, and your Grand Council crossed it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Admiral acted without full Council approval." "I know," I said, "and your Council removed him, and we received that information, and it did not change what happened on New Carthage. The people there are still gone. The Admiral being removed does not bring them back." He looked away from the screen. I waited. "Is there nothing," he said finally, "that can stop this?" I thought about lying. I thought about offering him something soft and diplomatic that would end the conversation gently. I did not. "I am not the person who decides that," I said. "I am an intelligence officer, but I can tell you this much. The fleet is not moving because someone in Earth's command lost their temper. It is moving because every calculation, every precedent, every assessment of how to protect human lives going forward points to the same conclusion. The lesson has to be real. It has to cost something that cannot be repaid with credits and apologies. Otherwise, it is not a lesson. It is just a negotiation, and the next species that wants something will look at this moment and decide that a negotiation is acceptable. Arath did not respond to that. After a long pause, he simply said, "I am sorry for New Carthage." And I believed him. I told him so. Then I closed the channel. I wrote in my personal log that evening, not about Arath or the diplomatic session, but about my grandmother. Her name was Dora Marsh, and she had grown up in a part of Earth's history that I will not detail here, except to say that she had survived something that should not have happened and had spent the rest of her life with a very particular kind of knowledge. The knowledge that terrible things are possible. The knowledge that hoping they will not happen is not the same as making sure they cannot. She used to say, when I was a child visiting her, that the most important thing a person could do was to make certain that the world understood consequences. Not to be cruel, not to seek revenge, but to make the lesson so clear, so permanent, so impossible to misunderstand, that no one would ever need to learn it twice. I thought about her that evening, sitting in my quarters aboard Station Aurelius, listening to the distant hum of the fleet engines warming up through the hull of the station. The fleet that 80 years of her generation and the generations that followed had quietly, patiently built, just in case. Around me, the galaxy was watching. The other civilizations had repositioned their own ships, not toward us, but away from the projected path of the Terran fleet. They moved carefully and quietly, getting out of the way you step back from the edge of a cliff. They were not neutral. They were simply wise enough to understand that this was not their conflict to enter. On the 7th day, the fleet crossed the border of HFY space on 40 simultaneous fronts. I watched the tactical displays from the command center. The formations were so large that the scale markers on the display had to be adjusted 3 times before they made visual sense. The HFY Navy responded. Of course it did. They had 4,000 warships, and whatever else could be said about the HFY, their navy fought with precision and courage. But 4,000 against 300,000, even spread across 40 entry points, is not a military equation. It is a demonstration. The lesson had begun. The HFY Navy's first response was fast. I will give them that. Within 9 minutes of the fleet's border crossing, their command network had assembled every available warship into a defensive grid covering their 3 core systems. The formation was textbook. It was exactly what their tactical doctrine called for, and under any normal circumstances, against any opponent they had ever faced, it would have been effective. These were not normal circumstances. I was watching the tactical feeds from the command center, seated at my station with Admiral Akafor 3 positions to my left. The room was calm, quiet, even. The people around me were professionals doing their jobs with the kind of focused competence that comes from years of training and, in this moment, from the absolute certainty of what was coming. No one was nervous. That was the thing I kept noticing. In every military engagement I had ever studied, there is a particular tension in the command room in the moments before contact, an alertness that borders on anxiety. I felt none of that here. I felt something closer to gravity, the steady, inevitable pull of a thing that had already been decided. The first contact engagements happened at the border of the HFY outer system. Our advance formations, roughly 12,000 ships, met their defensive grid head-on. The exchange lasted 43 minutes. I watched every second of it on the tactical display, and I noted something that I later included in my official report. The HFY Navy fought extremely well. Their coordination was tight. Their captains made smart decisions under impossible pressure. They adapted their formations twice in the first 20 minutes in ways that, in any conventional engagement, would have been genuinely effective responses. But there was no adapting to the numbers. Every time they shifted to counter one formation, 3 more were already in position. Every gap they identified in our approach was already covered. We had not simply brought more ships. We had brought enough ships to occupy every strategic position simultaneously, to offer no opening anywhere, to give their commanders nothing to work with except the choice between continuing and accepting the reality in front of them. HFY spoke only twice during the main engagement. The first time he said, "Confirm all civilian corridor designations are active." His communications officer confirmed they were. Every path out of the combat zone for non-military HFY vessels had been mapped and communicated on open channels before the first shot was fired. Civilian ships that moved toward those corridors were not engaged. Not a single one. The second time he spoke, about 2 hours into the campaign, he said simply, "Proceed to Phase 2. Phase 2 was the targeting of HFY military infrastructure, shipyards, weapons platforms, orbital command stations. Every target had been cataloged before the fleet left Terran space. Every strike was logged with its target designation, the reasoning for its inclusion on the target list, and the confirmation of its military nature. No residential areas. No civilian infrastructure. No hospitals, no schools, no food production facilities. Humanity goes to war the way it does everything else that matters. With preparation, with documentation, and with an absolute insistence on doing it correctly." I watched a HFY shipyard come apart on the tactical display. It was one of their largest facilities, capable of producing 12 warships per year. It had no civilian population aboard. It took 4 minutes to reduce to debris. I noted the timestamp, the target designation, and the confirmation code in my log, and moved to the next item. 6 hours into the campaign, a HFY fleet commander named Karen broadcast on an open channel. His transmission was received across the entire engagement zone, and we later learned, by every other species monitoring the situation. He spoke for 4 minutes. He said that his people had held this space for 300 years. He said that his navy would not abandon its post. He said that the HFY were not afraid of the Terran fleet, regardless of its size, and that history would judge this day clearly. It was a good speech. HFY listened to all of it. When it ended, he said quietly, to no one in particular, "Brave people." Then he gave the order to continue. I want to be precise about what happened next because I have read accounts written by other species that describe this moment in ways that are not accurate. Some of those accounts portray the Terran fleet as brutal, as overwhelming and indiscriminate. That is not what happened. What happened was precise, systematic. Every HFY military asset in their 3 core systems was located, targeted, and removed. It took 19 hours in total. During those 19 hours, not a single HFY civilian structure was struck. Not a single civilian ship was engaged. The corridors we had designated at the start of the campaign remained open the entire time, and every HFY civilian vessel that used them passed through safely. At the 17-hour mark, a transmission came in from the HFY Grand Council. It was brief. It said that they were requesting an immediate ceasefire and were prepared to discuss unconditional terms. HFY looked at the message. He said, "Acknowledge receipt. Tell them we will respond after the completion of Phase 2. Phase 2 finished at the 19-hour mark, to the minute. At that point, every HFY military installation in their core systems was gone. Their navy, those 4,000 ships that had fought so hard and so well, had been reduced to a fraction of its original strength, and the ships that remained had moved to non-combat positions. The HFY Grand Council's second message, sent during the final hour of the campaign, included the words "formal surrender." It was the fastest capitulation in the Concord's recorded history. I was not celebrating. None of us were. The room was quiet after HFY gave the stand-down order, and the quiet felt correct. This was not a victory in the way that word usually sounds. This was a conclusion. It was the end of a sentence that had begun the moment the first incendiary round had fallen on New Carthage, and like all sentences, it meant something specific and permanent. HFY walked past my station on his way out of the command room. He paused for a moment beside me and looked at the display. where the tactical situation was resolving into something orderly and still. "Write it all down," he said to me. "Every decision, every target, every timestamp, all of it." "I already have," I said. He nodded. "Good, because the record matters more than the outcome. Everyone needs to be able to read exactly what happened here and understand exactly why." He left. I stayed at my station for another hour, going through my logs, checking every entry, making sure the record was complete and accurate and clear. The rest of the galaxy was watching, just as HFY had known they would be. We had not blocked their sensors. We had not jammed their communication networks. We had let every species in the Concord observe every hour of those 19 hours in full, because the lesson only works if everyone can see it, if everyone can examine it, if no one can ever claim they did not understand what happened and why. I thought as I worked through the final entries in my log about what Quarter Vane had said in that Concord session. 4 words. Not sufficient. I thought about how right he had been and how necessary it had been to say exactly that and nothing more. The Vaughai had thought a territorial claim was sufficient reason to end 2.4 million lives. The Terran fleet had just explained, in terms that required no translation, why they were wrong. I returned to Earth 6 weeks after the campaign ended. Not on leave, on assignment. My new posting was in the Documentation and Record Division of Unified Command, which sounds like exactly the kind of quiet, administrative role it is, and I was glad to have it. I had spent the past several months at the center of something very large, and I needed for a while to do small and careful work. My first task was to assist in building the memorial archive for New Carthage. It was not what I expected. I had thought it would be a database project, something systematic and organized, like all the other record-keeping work I had done. And in structure it was. But the content of it was not like anything else I had worked on, and I understood that very quickly. The archive was a complete record of the colony, every person who had lived there, every name, every face, every profession, every personal detail that had been preserved in the colony's own records and in the memories of the survivors. The survivors had been found and brought home over the weeks following the campaign, and each of them had been offered the chance to contribute to the archive. Most of them had. They brought photos and recordings and handwritten documents that had been stored in survival pod memory banks. They brought the small, ordinary things that people keep because they matter. A woman named Claire Holden had survived because she had been inside a deep drilling station 3 kilometers underground when the strike happened. She was a geologist, 34 years old, and she had been born on New Carthage. It was the only home she had ever known. She brought to the archive, among other things, a recording of her daughter's 4th birthday party, taken 6 months before the strike. The recording was 22 minutes long. It was a very ordinary birthday party. There were paper decorations and a homemade cake and several children running around a garden in the afternoon sun, and her daughter's name was Molly, and she laughed the entire time. I watched that recording twice while cataloging it. The second time, I made sure no one else was in the room. A man named Owen Perry had survived because he had been on a cargo run to a neighboring system and had been in transit when the strike happened. He came back to New Carthage as quickly as he could once he heard what had happened, joining the search teams in the first days. He had found 3 survivors in the wreckage before he found his own house. He cataloged what he could find of his neighborhood's records. He brought photographs of the Central Market in Ardenmore, where he had sold fresh produce every weekend for 12 years. He knew every vendor by name and brought their names to the archive, one by one, and told us what each of them had sold and where they had stood and what they had been like as people. I added every name to the record, every single one. The archive grew very large. When it was complete, it contained entries for more than 2.4 million people, cross-referenced with every piece of available documentation. It was the most thorough memorial record in Terran history, possibly in any species' history. Unified Command had committed significant resources to making it so, because HFY's instruction applied here as much as it did to the battle logs. The record matters. Everything must be written down. Everyone must be remembered. While I was working on the archive, the Galactic Concord was working on something of its own. The process had begun almost immediately after the Volcae surrender, driven by a coalition of 7 species who had watched the 19-hour campaign and arrived at the same conclusion. The rules needed to change. The document they produced was called the New Carthage Accord. It took 11 weeks to draft and required the signature of every Concord member to take effect. It established, in formal and permanent terms, that colony worlds of any species recognized under Concord membership were to be considered inviolable. An attack on a colony world would trigger automatic Concord-level response, not just from the defending species, but from a standing coalition of member nations. The enforcement framework was detailed and specific and included, at Terran insistence, a clear and unambiguous definition of what constituted an attack. Humanity did not write the accord. We contributed to the discussions, but we did not lead them. We did not need to. The other species had seen enough. They knew what they were doing and why, and they did it without being asked. Corder Vane signed on behalf of Earth at the formal ceremony. He was quiet, as always, but I watched the recording and I noticed something in his expression when he pressed his signature to the document. Not pride, not satisfaction, something quieter. The look of a man who has done what needed to be done and is prepared to go home. I was finishing the final entries in the New Carthage archive on a Tuesday afternoon when Admiral HFY came to find me. He came in person, which was unusual. He sat down across from me and said, without preamble, "I am putting your name forward for Rear Admiral." I looked at him for a moment. "No," I said. He had expected this. I could tell by the way he did not react with any surprise. "You have earned it," he said. "I know," I said, "but that is not the right job for me. I would like to request reassignment to a border patrol vessel, Outer Rim, one of the new deep range monitors." He considered this. Why? I thought about how to answer that, and I thought about my grandmother Dora, and I thought about what she had understood that most people prefer not to think about. That the worst things are possible. That preparation is not pessimism. That watching carefully all the time is not fear. It is love. Because the lesson we just gave was clear, I said. But clear lessons have a way of fatting. Someone needs to be out there at the edge watching, making sure things stay the way they need to stay. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." He stood up to leave, and at the door he paused and looked back at me. "Take the archive copies with you," he said. "Every border patrol vessel should have them." He left. I returned to my work. There were 7 more entries to complete, 7 more names to add with their full details and the memories that the survivors had contributed. I worked through them one by one, carefully and completely. I took my time. Each name deserved its full attention, its full record, its rightful place in the permanent document that would outlast all of us. When the archive was finished, I sat with it for a while. 2.4 million entries. A whole world of people, preserved as completely as records and memory allowed. Then I closed the archive, saved the final version to 3 separate secure locations, and began packing for my new posting. My ship was called the ETV Durable, a deep-range patrol monitor assigned to the Outer Rim, 6 light weeks from the nearest major colony. It was not a large ship. It was built for endurance, not for combat, though it carried enough capability to be useful if capability was ever required. The crew was 12 people, experienced and self-sufficient, the kind of crew that does their job without needing to be told why it matters. We launched on a Thursday morning. I stood at the observation port as we cleared the orbital lanes above Earth and entered open space, and I watched the planet grow smaller until it was a blue point among many points, and then I turned away from the port and walked to my station. The Outer Rim was quiet when we arrived. It usually is. The vast distances between colony worlds mean that most days on border patrol pass without incident. You watch, you log, you monitor the long-range arrays, you check in with the colony nearest your assigned sector, you run through your daily protocols. It is routine and careful and unglamorous. I found that I did not mind any of that. About 3 weeks into the posting, I was on the late watch when the navigation system flagged a familiar stellar object on the long-range display. I checked the catalog tag. It took me a moment to process what I was looking at. It was the star that New Carthage had orbited. It was visible from this position, a faint point in the array, unremarkable among the thousands of other points around it. I pulled up the telemetry and let the system run the light travel calculation. The light reaching my display now had left that star before the colony was struck. I was looking at a time before any of it had happened. The star had no way of knowing yet. I sat with that for a while. The ship hummed quietly around me. The rest of the crew was asleep. There is a thing that happens when you look at old light. You understand in a way that is hard to put into words that the universe carries everything forward whether we are ready or not. That the light from a destroyed place keeps traveling long after the destruction. That the record of what something was does not disappear just because the thing itself is gone. It travels on, indefinitely at the speed of light, out into the dark. New Carthage was gone, but the light from its star was still here, and in a secure archive aboard the ship and in 100 other places throughout Terran space, 2.4 million names were recorded in full. Every person who had been a child in Ardenmore, every farmer who had worked red soil under an alien sun, every vendor in the central market who had stood in their place every weekend for years and sold things and talked to their neighbors and been part of something. I remember all of their names. That is the work I have given myself, along with the watching, the remembering, the keeping of the record, because the record is the thing that turns loss into meaning, and meaning into resolve, and resolve into the quiet, steady certainty that it will not happen again. Not on our watch. Not ever. I turned back to my instruments. The long-range arrays were showing nothing unusual. The outer rim was quiet, as it should be. The light from New Carthage's star continued its long journey in every direction at once, carrying forward the signal of a place that had existed, that had mattered, that had been home to people who deserved better. I logged the entry, marked the watch, and kept watching. That is all any of us can do in the end, and that is enough.